Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Con Maciel Carey 2026 Cal OSHA webinar series. It is our first webinar of the year, and we are starting off with Cal OSHA's High Hazard Unit, how employers can prepare for targeted enforcement in high hazard industries. And my name is Rachel Kahn. I am chair of the California practice and as well as a partner. And I work on all things OSHA, Cal OSHA related. And I'm joined by my partner here in California, Megan Shaked, who not only focuses on Cal OSHA, but also all California labor and employment needs. So we will be your panelists today as we walk you through everything you need to know about Cal OSHA's high hazard unit and how to prepare. So starting off with our agenda, I'm going to start off with the background of the high hazard employer program. Some of you on this call may be very familiar with high hazard, having already been on the list and dealt with those inspections in the past or going through them, and some of you may not. And so we'll give you a background as to what it is, what its mandate, and the things that you can expect to see from them. We'll also go through what their targeted enforcement looks like. And again, kind of where they get that authority, where they get their policies and procedures, as well as some of the data. So that will help better prepare you and your sites for any potential high hazard activity. And then Megan's going to go through some commonly cited regulations that we see in the high hazard inspections. Megan and I both do a lot of work with high hazard inspections, as well as defending citations that come out of high hazard inspections. So we're going to go through not only some of the top violations and regulations that are cited by Cal OSHA generally, but the ones we see most often in high hazard. And unfortunately, a lot of kind of the nitpicky ones that you're going to see coming out of a high hazard inspection are also the ones that are the highest in potential repeats. So we want to make sure that you're certainly aware of those and that your facilities are taking the steps that they can take to minimize any type of exposure around those really common citations and commonly cited regulations. And then Megan's going to close it out with some of the best practices for managing high hazard inspections. So again, if you're on the list and you know that there is a potential for these types of inspections, then you certainly want to make sure that your facilities are prepared and that they're doing their own internal inspections to ensure that they're minimizing their potential liability if they should get one of these inspections. So background on high hazard industries and the high hazard unit. So the California Labor Code, that's where all of Cal OSHA, or the division as it's more appropriately called, gets all of its authority, is from the California Labor Code, and the high hazard unit is no different. And the statutes also, they outline what Cal OSHA needs to do to oversee these high hazard industries. So the Labor Code requires that the division establish a program for targeting employers in high hazard industries with the highest incidence of preventable occupational injuries and illnesses and workers' compensation losses. And that is to ensure the highest hazard employers and the most hazardous industries are inspected on a priority basis. And this is, if you want to look it up, this is in the Labor Code and in its section 6314.1, but certainly makes sense that there should be some priority to those industries that are going to have the highest potential injuries and illnesses, and that do have the highest injuries or illnesses, and that resources from Cal OSHA should be dedicated in those areas. And in addition, and this is one that I haven't seen all that often, but that it is in the statute and Cal OSHA does have the ability to do. But the division may send a letter to high hazard employers informing them of their status and directing them to submit a plan. And that plan would include the establishment of a joint labor management health and safety committees, and within a time determined by the division for reducing their occupational injuries or illnesses. And employers who submit plans that meet the requirements of the division may be placed on a secondary inspection schedule. So again, this is in the code, but it's not one that I have seen Cal OSHA utilize that often, which is rather interesting because if you've been following our webinars for any amount of time or our blogs, you know that Cal OSHA has a significant staffing shortage, and that things like the high hazard unit suffer from staffing issues. And so to meet all the different high hazard inspections that they should be doing, something like this could easily kind of cut down on that workload. But we certainly haven't seen a high amount of this utilized, or at least utilized anytime recently. But it is in their toolkit to be used if they want to. So the high hazard enforcement program dedicated to target programmed inspections in high hazard industries. So for some of you on the call, you may be saying, well, what's a high hazard industry? We'll get to that in a minute. But the high hazard unit, it has 3 different offices: the North, the South, and the Central, which is a new office, and it has a new district manager who is Philip Johnson. I actually was on a status conference with him last week. So if you had high hazard inspections or citations and appeals in either the North or the South, that would now be covered by Central. You will see Philip now popping up to take over those matters. So if you see him, that's who it is. He is new to that unit and taking over that new central unit. And all of this is under a regional office. So note, inspections can also be delegated to non-high hazard regional offices as well. But remember, all of the regional offices are suffering from staffing shortages. And I know in 2024, and we'll talk about this in a minute as well, that the high hazard unit was not able to conduct as many inspections as they wanted to due to that staffing and low staffing in other offices where they couldn't rely on them to provide some additional support. And one thing that I do want to highlight about the high hazard unit and inspections is that you will see some of the same inspectors as well as the same district managers, of course. And so they do have a tendency to get familiar with your work site if that's an area that they have been, frequently been there. And so you certainly want to make sure that you're addressing anything, even if it's not in a citation, you're addressing it because you may see them more and more often. High hazard inspections can be programmed, follow-ups, accident-related, complaint-driven, unprogrammed, or through referrals. So there's multiple ways that you will see high hazard inspections pop up. It's just not in one area. But so do know that they can pop up in all of the traditional ways that you see inspections pop up. Consultation as well can identify hazardous industries, and they can provide on-site consultation assistance. That is one, again, that we usually counsel employers to be a little cautious of because, you know, on its surface, it seems like a good idea to have consultation come in and review your facility, particularly if it's high hazard and you might be susceptible to inspections. But if they identify things as hazards that go unabated, or maybe you don't agree that are actually hazards, and you don't fix them or abate them, then that can set you up for a willful citation. So always, if you're going to utilize the consultation program, I suggest that you work with your counsel beforehand. As we noted before, the high hazard unit inspects employers and industries with the highest incidence of preventable occupational injuries or illnesses and workers' comp losses. And employers may be selected and targeted by utilizing data sources such as, not limited to, workers' comp loss data, history of Cal OSHA citations, and other data sources that were provided in the labor code. So the labor code does list out what those data sources that Cal OSHA can utilize to determine whether or not somebody is in a high hazard industry or what the high hazard industry is. So the annual high hazard industry list is based on the DART rates for private sector employees. So that's days away, restricted, or transferred. And in 2024, the high hazard unit conducted 268 inspections here in California, although its goal was 150 inspections. And they said that due to staffing shortages, they weren't able to meet that goal. But as many of you know on this call that may deal with Cal OSHA frequently, they are trying to staff that up. And so you may see some additional outreach from Cal OSHA's high hazard unit as Cal OSHA just generally continues to staff. This slide and the next slide is just going to outline for you. You can see the data based on the different industries and the past, this goes through 2023, but the look back period there for those 3 years as to the industry and the number of inspections for that industry and what that percentage looks like. So here, on this page, you can see in 2023, retail had some of the highest percentage of inspections. If we go to the next slide, you can see that healthcare had some of the highest percentages. That may have to deal a little bit with COVID, but you can see how the breakdown, at least for that 3-year look back period. We can put that against what just the Cal OSHA inspection overview data looks like for almost the past 9 years. And you'll see here, this doesn't include programmed inspections, but this, for example, in 2024, the high hazard unit again did a little under 300 inspections, and you can see how that measures up to all of the other inspections that they do. So a very small percentage of what the inspections they do overall, but again, in that dedicated unit. And this includes inspections by type of industry. And so you will see that many of these are going to be in your high hazard list. And I don't think that there are any surprises here in terms of what industries have the highest amount of different types of inspections, with construction being the highest. Interestingly, when we take a look at the high hazard list, some of the ones with the highest DART rates are not construction, but overall, construction still has the highest amount of inspections, despite not having the highest DART rate on the industry list, but still has the highest amount of inspections. So there's a whole lot of different ways that you can take a look at this data. So just because you're in the high hazard unit doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have more inspections than other industries, but it does mean that Cal OSHA, you will have inspections or potentially have inspections based on that designation, as opposed to other industries that may have higher rates of reportable incidents. Additional background: California has a commission on health and safety and workers' compensation, and that commission prepares annual reports covering the performance of the California workers' comp system, including discussion of the divisions of the division and their high hazard program. And so I think Megan's going to talk about that a little later on and how that may come into play in these inspections as well. And if you've never looked at the Cal OSHA Policy and Procedures manual, we certainly encourage you to do so. That is the manual that Cal OSHA internally uses for things like inspections. And they have policies and procedures to address high hazard inspections. And if you are on the high hazard list, we recommend that you check it out. The link is here, and it will go through how the inspections are to be conducted by the inspector, as well as how different industries may be selected for being put on the list. Cal OSHA recently, they may still be in the process of updating some sections of the policy and procedure manual after that was the result of the California audit, and they have been internally updating some of their policies and procedures around inspections. But the high hazard parts do not look like they've been updated. Most of the sections, I think, are going to be around complaints, where now Cal OSHA is going to be on site for any serious complaint. But back to the high hazards, C19, that part of the procedural manual goes through the policies for programmed inspection targeting for high hazard industries. And then in 19A, it does list out establishing how they establish the high hazard industries, as well as the non-high hazard industries and low hazard industries. And those are identified because they may have certain exemptions from different types of record keeping requirements. But if you want some additional detail on how Cal OSHA goes about establishing these high hazard industries, I recommend that you take a look at C19A, and it will give you even more detail about how they go about doing so. So all high hazard inspections are comprehensive in scope. So that means, if you have, for example, if you have a accident, when Cal OSHA comes in to inspect, they may just limit their inspection to that area of the accident, or if it's a complaint inspection, to the area of the complaint. But for high hazard inspections, again, that are comprehensive in scope, that means that substantially complete inspections they must do substantially complete inspections of the potential high hazard areas of the establishment. So we're looking at a much broader, potentially much broader inspection than you would be used to if you've had a reportable or a complaint. So again, that's certainly a reason why you want to make sure that you're prepared for these inspections, because they can be very, very broad in nature. And the high hazard inspection procedures generally apply to the fixed site private sector establishments and do not apply to other programmed inspections. So that would include things like inspections by mining and tunneling, PSM, and the Labor and Enforcement Task Force. And the high hazard industries list is established each year, and it identifies industry groups by their industry codes that collectively have DART rates of more than 200% of the California private sector average. So then the division, the DOSH prioritizes groups for targeting using a number of factors. And these factors include hazard or industries addressed by different federal emphasis programs. So, for example, amputations. It can also be the hazard is covered by a new or unique California standard or federal program. So, here, of course, one of the special emphasis programs in California is heat illness, has been and will be for a while. So the DART rate is calculated by dividing the total number of DART cases by the total number of hours worked and then multiplied by 200,000. DOSH prioritizes the targeted high hazard enforcement, also using a number of factors, including the high profile hazard where Cal OSHA enforcement activity could have a strong deterrent effect in a particular industry. So, for example, material handling in warehouses, and the hazard creates a significant number of serious injuries, illnesses, or fatalities in California relative to other industries. So, for example, machine guarding and metalwork. And they can also use evaluation of past and current selections. And there's all of the factors that Cal OSHA uses, again, are outlined in their PMP in section C19. So again, I encourage you to, if you want some more information about that, you can dig in there as well. So the new high hazard list began on the new fiscal year, and that's based on the federal fiscal year, and that is October 1, 2025. So you will always see a new list come out October 1. So what was some of the information that based on the new industry list, DART rates were actually down. Based on 200% of the average DART rate for 2024. So that rate was 2.0, and the new rate is 4.0. There are 42 sectors included on the list, and that is actually up from the previous year. However, the number of establishments are down, but the number of employees covered in that are actually up. And there are 18 sectors that remained on the list from 2024 that transferred over to the 2025 list. And I know this is a little hard to read, but the link is down here below if you want to check out the full list. So we just, on this slide and the next slide, have this up for you so you can see the different industries listed, their DART code, their establishments, and their employees. So some of the ones that had the highest DART codes, and again, this is kind of DART rates, I'm sorry, this is based on 2024. You'll see things like soft drink manufacturing had some of the highest, material handling equipment manufacturing, seasoning and dressing manufacturing, beef and cattle ranching and farming, including feedlots, some of the top ones on here. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see some additional ones. And one of the highest industries with the highest DART rate was actually couriers and messengers. So they had one of the highest DART rates in 2024. So, could your site be selected? A number of methods are used for targeting establishments, and that is they randomize. That is one method that they use to do it. They experience modification rate, so your X mod rate, which you're going to get from your workers' comp, specific injury and illness types, and other workers' compensation data. So again, this is all broken down into the P&P manual where they get into the real specifics about each one of these methods and how they take that method and apply it to the different industries to determine who is established. And within those, they usually break it down in how they prioritize high hazard industries as well as how they select individual establishments for each one of those methods. Are there any exemptions? So a high hazard inspection can be deferred or exempt under certain conditions. So the establishment has received voluntary protection program status, so VPP, and that is a 3-year exemption from initial certification date. Establishment is currently in the SHARP program. That is going to be a 2-year deferral. An establishment has received a full service consultation recently, has scheduled or is in the process of one. Again, you'll want to talk to counsel before bringing in consultation, but that is an option to defer or exempt your facility from a high hazard inspection. A high hazard inspection can be deferred also if the establishment has received a comprehensive enforcement inspection within the last 3 years. So that's a 3-year deferral from the opening conference. The establishment currently is undergoing an unprogrammed inspection, and the establishment temporarily not performing the activities for which it was targeted or has moved the activities to another location. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan. Now that you guys have the background about what high hazard is and what it does, she's going to walk you through some of the top Cal OSHA violations, the top violations we see in high hazard, and some tips for how to prepare your site for those inspections.
So one thing we wanted to remind you all about is the that Cal OSHA puts out a list of the top 10 most frequently cited standards. And they put this out specifically, they say why they're sharing it with employers. And they say that it's to alert employers about these commonly cited standards so they can take steps to find and fix these recognized hazards and prevent workplace injuries and illnesses and keep Cal OSHA from showing up. Far too many preventable workplace injuries, illnesses, and deaths are related to these top 10 most frequently cited standards. And we provided you the link so you can go visit this list. And as you can tell from some of the data that we've provided in the report that we'll reference, there's a little bit of a delay in Cal OSHA sharing the data. So sometimes it can be a number of years old, but this is a really important place to start because understanding not only generally Cal OSHA's most frequently cited regulations and violations and types of hazards and types of requirements, but understanding in particular your industries and how they apply to your workplace is a really, really huge part of, like Cal OSHA says, identifying those recognized hazards and making sure that they're being addressed. So the same thing, while this comment is not geared specifically for high hazard, the same concept applies. And they also put out a number of other resources. So the Cal OSHA website has, for example, information about complaints, inspections with an initial penalty of $100,000 or more, um, and lots of other data that you can, if you have a free moment or two, that you can go and see what sorts of things are generating citations, complaint-driven citations or programmed inspections or any sort of inspection, and then separately, which ones are getting the highest penalties. So you can get a sense of the agency's priorities and also what they see as some of the most, and I don't mean this in the sense of what Cal OSHA treats as egregious violation, which is a term of art under Cal OSHA, but I mean it in terms of what Cal OSHA sees as some of the worst violations and when they issue those really, really high penalty citations. So it's a good background to have because Cal OSHA is certainly working with all of that background when they conduct their inspections and make a decision about the citations to issue. Another helpful, there's another link to the top 10 violations on there, but we've also included a link to the Federal OSHA Establishment Search, which is a database where you can search employers over you can control how far back in time you go, and you can see kind of what's in the record for a given employer name in a given jurisdiction. So if you're looking for California specific, you can restrict it to California. You can restrict it to the last 5 years. So you can look at your given employer's 5-year look back period for the purpose of analyzing a potential risk of repeat for a similar citation that has issued or become final over the last 5 years. So these can be really helpful public resources in terms of prioritizing your own review of your safety program and other information that might be helpful. This is the 2024 top Cal OSHA violation list. So number one on the list is the unique to California Injury and Illness Prevention Program requirement, also known as IIPP. I've also heard people call it I2P2. So this is 3203. This is the general industry requirement for injury, illness, and prevention. And this is where Cal OSHA will often cite if there is a hazard that hasn't been adequately in their mind identified or addressed or otherwise dealt with by the employer. So that is the number one most frequently cited regulation. You also see it in the number 3 spot, the version that applies for construction industry. Number 2 spot has our outdoor heat illness prevention requirement, which is under 3395. Also, just we'll throw in a mention for the indoor heat under 3396. If either or both applies to your work site, you want to make sure that that is fully addressed. Come back to this later, but since heat is an emphasis program in California, and since Cal OSHA is required to ask about an employer's IIPP in any sort of inspection, certainly high hazard inspections, since they are comprehensive, will ask about those issues, even if they are not necessarily an issue raised by at the work site, right? Maybe there was a complaint or maybe there was an incident or a report or something, even if it doesn't have to do with IPP or heat, there will be questions from the agency about those because they're required to do that right now. Number 4 is the reporting requirement. There's a requirement in California to report serious injuries and illnesses under certain circumstances. This sometimes employers who have operations outside of California are not always aware of the nuance of the difference in California. There is an 8-hour reporting requirement in California, and there's some other nuance to the California regulation. There's certain limits that exist outside of California at the federal level and in other states do not exist in California. Some of the exceptions that you're familiar with do apply, but the particular requirements live in different sections of the regulation. So it can sometimes be tricky for an employer when they get an emergency call of an incident that has just happened to have all of that information at their fingertips. So making sure you understand the very specific requirements and the nuance in California is really important because those 8 hours can go by very, very quickly, particularly over, off hours or weekends or holidays. Number 5 slot is for hazard communication under 5194. So making sure employers who have employees interacting with hazardous chemicals and cleaning products and different things like that are getting the policies, the training, and they know what to do to work with those materials safely. Number 6 slot is lockout tagout for control of hazardous energy under 3314. Again, there can be some nuance to California, so important to understand that and make sure that your lockout tagout programs, if you are required to have them, are in good shape and in full compliance. There's lots of individual technical requirements for that. And then we get into a couple. Well, I guess this next one for sure. Number 7 is for portable fire extinguishers. This is something I do particularly highlight for high hazard, with another comment in mind, which is yes, it's a comprehensive inspection, right? So the scope of it may be more broad than it would be if it was a complaint-driven inspection or an incident-driven inspection. But just like any inspection, anything that is in plain view is something that a Cal OSHA inspector can make observations about and consider whether issuing citations. So when you think about portable fire extinguishers, which can be throughout a facility, need to be accessible and need to be viewable, there can be issues with these being blocked or being put in a place that's not easily accessible. So that's something that is definitely something to look at, though it may not be obvious as a high hazard issue. Number 8 is for respiratory protection under 5144. So making sure if that applies to your workforce that you're in compliance with all of those requirements. Number 9 is for silica. So this may not apply across the board, but it's cited quite frequently. So if that's an issue for your any of your work sites, that's one to keep in mind. And then I'll come back to this one in a bit because we saw Cal OSHA put a lot of emphasis on this requirement, but number 10 spot in 2024 was for emergency eye wash and shower facilities. And those can fall under a couple of regulations, and I'll come back to that. I did want to mention a couple of notable mentions from that report that Rachel mentioned, the Commission on Health and Safety and Workers' Compensation. So this is a report that is made available to the public. So it's on the Cal OSHA website. And the most recent one we have is from 2024. And high hazard employer program is something that's specifically addressed in this report. So it can be a helpful resource, again, if you have time to dig through the report. But I did some of the work for you and I pulled out some of the most frequently cited regulations through the high hazard inspection program. And then we'll finish up this section on the regulations with some of the most frequently cited regulations that are sometimes misunderstood or not caught as easily. And so we'll just go through this list. one thing to remember is you really have to, it's worthwhile exercise to go through your operations and your industry because, again, the whole point of the high hazard unit is to do targeted inspections of industries that have the highest rates of preventable occupational health and excuse me, occupational health and illness. So you want to think through the whole scope because it's not limited to the regulations that we've covered in these last few slides. You want to think globally about all of your OSHA regulations, all of your OSHA requirements, and what might be the most frequently, might be an issue that comes up most frequently. And think through that. So here, obviously, if you don't have industrial trucks in your workplace, this wouldn't apply. But if you have a lot of them, that's something to put a little bit more thought into. Another one that comes up quite frequently is the working space around about electrical equipment. And you'll see in parentheses, I've included the specific regulation that was referenced in the report, but obviously section 2340.16 is not the only regulation that talks about safe work around electrical equipment. There are others, but this was the one that was identified under the report. There was also a section under the portable ladders section. Um, for construction industry specifically, there was a section identified for emergency medical services. There are particular requirements for that industry. Section 461 was mentioned because California requires permits to operate air tanks, which is a unique requirement, and there's an entire pressure vessel unit within Cal OSHA dedicated to handling those inspections, or they can also be handled by a designated person through insurance. 3328 is included, which is a section on safe practices about machinery and equipment. I'll come back to this one in a moment too. We have another regulation that was cited for industrial trucks. That one is for operator training. See that one a lot. 1670 is for personal fall arrest systems, personal restraint systems, and positioning devices. And we have people working at heights. This is a one to take another look at. We have one for under 2500.8 for flexible electrical cords and cables. This is the section that discusses the uses that are not permitted, but there are other sections that talk about uses that are permitted, as well as some other electrical safety regulations that are worth a second look at if you're not familiar. Section 3380 talks about personal protective devices. There are also a number of others that are specific to certain parts of the body, for example, hands or the body in general. 5189 made the list, which is specific to process safety management of acutely hazardous materials. The next one is 2473.2, which is about covers for pull boxes, junction boxes, and fittings. So we've seen a few come up for electrical safety. 1712 made the list for requirements for impalement protection. This can be covers on rebar and construction or other circumstances. 4650 was listed for compressed gas and air cylinders. This is unlike the permits for the air tanks, this is specific to the actual use or handling or storage of those tanks. And then finally, 3273 for working area maintenance. So this is, thinking about the area in which an employee is actually working, making sure that area is safe. So going through just a couple of them that I mentioned, I would come back to, like I said, with the pressure vessels requirement, again, in California, air tanks, LPG propane storage tanks above a certain capacity, as well as high pressure boilers over a certain threshold pressure are required to be permitted. There are certain exceptions, but the thing to take away is that certain pressure vessels have to be permitted in California. The pressure vessel unit can do permit inspections themselves. You can contact them and request that they do the permit, or a inspector qualified by insurance companies can do the inspections also. And then those permits have to be displayed and readily available. There's also some other requirements in those pressure vessel regulations, but that's the thing to keep in mind that's special about California. And then there is there's two groups worth of electrical safety orders that fall into either low voltage electrical safety orders or high voltage electrical safety orders. These have a number of requirements that are frequently reviewed during broad scope inspections. They can cover anything from, damage to the outer sheath of a power cord to the space around electrical equipment. Like I said earlier, uses that are permitted and uses that are not permitted when using flexible cords, think extension cords, when those may or may not be allowed to be used. Other unsafe uses of extension cords, and many other details. So if this is something that's kind of flown under the radar or not something that's part of regular audits or checks, worth a second look for sure. And then two other categories included on this slide. One is like I said, this was the last category that was identified in that commission report, which is making sure that the areas where the employees are actually working are safe. This can include regulations. We often refer to them colloquially as the walking working surfaces rules. There's also specific rules about scaffolds, different types of ladders, lots of technical requirements, and a good thing to be familiar with as well. And then machine hazards, there was that 3328 section that was cited. So just a note here that there's a category of regulations that are ensuring protection from hazardous points of machinery. So that can either be the actual point of operation, or it can be other hazardous parts of machinery, rotating parts, things that can create nip points or pinch points, things like that. There's a whole slew of very specific technical requirements based on particular types of equipment. There's a whole number of guarding requirements, and lots of specific regulations protecting from, like I said, pinch points or other hazards from interacting with machinery and equipment. And then finally, wanted to highlight some of the specifics about the California emergency eye wash and shower requirements. There is, again, some nuance here, the difference between what is permissible at the federal level and what Cal OSHA expects to see in California. So there are eye wash requirements. They have to meet certain technical specifications under the ANSI standards. And then there are same thing for showers. There's also, requirements about checking them to make sure that they are in operation, that they are accessible within a certain space and a certain amount of time. That there's, of course, no obstructions to accessing them, as well as some very technical specifications about how they operate to make sure that if for somebody who needs to use them, that they're easy to get that water flowing at the right amount and for the correct length of time. Another kind of the last category of thing that's helpful to be familiar with is if there are any state or federal emphasis programs that could draw in interest from Cal OSHA about a particular topic that may not necessarily be on your radar when you get if you get a high hazard inspection. And the easiest one that comes to mind is heat. We get a lot of questions. Why are we asking about heat? It's January, it's raining, there is no high heat hazard present in our workplace. Why are we talking about heat? There may be an emphasis program that requires Cal OSHA to inquire about certain topics, even when it's not readily apparent from the inspection. All right, so for the last little bit of the hour, and thank you all for your time, we wanted to provide just a high level, some reminders about how to think about inspections, particularly with respect to high hazard inspections. Now, Rachel and I could talk all day long about tips and best practices for preparing for inspections. In fact, we have an entire master class on the subject. So this is more answering the question of, what can we do longer term to prepare for a high hazard inspection rather than, all right, Cal OSHA's in the lobby. What do we do right now? We're happy to have those conversations anytime. So one thing to think about when it comes to high hazard inspections, if you're on the list, is do you want to be reactive or do you want to be proactive? And when OSHA shows up, it certainly can get the adrenaline rushing and create a sense of panic and rush. But if you are prepared for an inspection, if you know the process to follow, you can feel like you're in much more control of the process and have a better understanding of the process. And the reality is that inspections are often testing the safety program, right? So you kind of can think ahead of time, what are the things that Cal OSHA is going to be looking at, and making sure you have the program that you want to have. So, big picture, during an inspection, OSHA is going to do a walk around. So, they're going to walk around the facility, Cal OSHA inspector, accompanied by a representative of the employer. They will conduct interviews with employees. Those can be with members of management and non-management. And they'll likely ask lots of specific questions about safety programs and training and equipment and process and paperwork, supervision, and all sorts of other things. And then they will make a document request and give you very, very little time, often, to produce those documents. And again, since high hazard is a full scope inspection, wall to wall, comprehensive inspection, those document requests can be much larger than they might be in a complaint driven or incident driven inspection, which might be very much more limited to the issue that has arisen. Another thing to think about ahead of time is kind of what your plan is, if there's a request for participation by a union, and then not always an issue in high hazard inspections, but always good to think through if there's anything else going on at the work site that might increase the stakes of a inspection. For example, recent complaints or a fatal injury or a much more serious injury. If there is third-party litigation, for example, or in the case of fatalities, if there's also going to be an investigation by the Bureau of Investigation. Uh, Another way to be proactive about high hazard inspections, or any inspections for that matter, is to have a really good understanding of the hazards in the workplace. You can do periodic review of OSHA records to identify patterns of injury or illnesses. You can also look at safety-related disciplinary records to see if those suggest any gaps in training or any practices that could be refined, as well as looking at any employee complaints or near miss reports, which can sometimes identify hazards before they even result in any issues, so those can be addressed right away. And this data can all be used to, like I said, identify any high risk areas or tasks, any new issues that has maybe arisen since the last time it was reviewed. So there's an opportunity to make improvements to the extent possible. There's a lot that can be done with prioritizing safety training, especially when you've identified some gaps. You can do, a retraining just on a specific issue that has arisen and have a particular focus on that. It's also an opportunity, it can be if appropriate, to update written materials like your IAPP or hazard assessments or other policies that could maybe be updated to reflect current processes and also can review just general workplace safety culture and compliance in general to see if there's anything that can be addressed. Um, to the point of Cal OSHA is always going to request documents as part of an inspection. It can be helpful to review those documents as if you're looking at it with Cal OSHA lenses on. So you can look at documents up against the regulatory requirements and see if I were a Cal OSHA inspector going through, for example, the indoor heat illness regulation, are all of the requirements for an employer to address present in our indoor heat illness policy and training and documentation. So you can see that there's a connection there. Another helpful exercise can be making sure that the requirements that are written on paper are actually being used. Sometimes employers go above and beyond what's required by Cal OSHA regulations, but then recognize that if you've created new requirements and you've included that in a policy or a training document, that is now required by the employer. And if the employer doesn't insist on those procedures being followed, then Cal OSHA will see that as a deficiency, even if the regulation itself does not require it. Another thing to make sure, because sometimes documents exist for quite some time as processes and procedures, and staffing may change, or staffing may move up to supervisory levels. You're making sure that your program documents really match your operations and are aligned with the training that your folks are receiving. Sometimes, it's easy to use a generic form that doesn't quite fit your organization, doesn't quite fit the operations, and making sure that those have been properly customized and all of that so that it works for your work site. Um, Same thing about making sure a broader safety program is internally consistent, and that different overlapping teams who may work on something are all on the same page about what programs and policies exist and should be utilized. It's obviously, important to make sure you're reviewing all of this and tracking things and doing audits to ensure that those things that you've implemented are actually being utilized. And so checking your programs, the effectiveness of your program is a huge part of the review, making sure that you're doing periodic inspections, reviewing your programs, doing your audits, perhaps underprivileged, perhaps not, conducting your accident investigations, and reviewing your documentation. I think we covered the review of OSHA records, but we put a little bit more in there. And then one final note is making sure that there is follow through. If there are issues that are identified or there's corrective actions or measures that need to be taken after a near miss or an incident or a complaint, or anything really, that those corrective actions are being documented, they're actually being performed, and then there's a check to make sure that they are working. We wanted to, I'll just leave it on that slide to wrap up. We wanted to, again, make sure that you had kind of those high level reminders of things that you can do any day of the week to prepare for a high hazard inspection, whether you're on the list or you've been on the list in the past, you think you might be on the list again, or really these are good tips for preparing for any type of inspection, whether or not it's performed by the high hazard unit. As Rachel said, this is our first webinar of 2026. So you'll get in the slides all of our webinars for the remainder of the year, and I'll pass it back to Rachel for final comments.
I froze there for a second, but I wanted to give everybody also a heads up. If you have been following the worker walk-around rule at the federal level, on Friday, Cal OSHA issued a notice of rulemaking to proposed worker walk-around rule here in California. So stay tuned for that. We're going to release a blog later this week that goes through that as well, but wanted to give everybody a heads up as we talk about inspections. That is a main thing that is on in the landscape here in California. And I know Megan talked a lot about some of the unique Cal OSHA regulations that we have here in California. And we're going to be doing a webinar next month that we talk about the unique Cal OSHA and other West Coast regulations that are unique. So California, Oregon, Washington, maybe a little Nevada in there. So if you are not as familiar with those, definitely tune in for those. And sign up for those, the blog, and then we do have our Cal OSHA and Employment Law Summit coming up in October as well. So thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.